The sun was a white-hot hammer striking an anvil of red stone. It hung high and motionless over the fractured spine of the borderlands, bleaching the color from the sky and turning the horizon into a wavering blur of heat and dust. Elias Ward rode with his hat pulled low, his eyes narrowed to slits against the glare. The brim of his Stetson was stained with sweat and grime, crumbling at the edge, much like the man beneath it. He sat atop a gelding that was more bone than muscle, a roan that had once been sturdy but was now stumbling with every third step. They had been moving for 3 days without good water, chasing a rumor of a pass that did not seem to exist. The land here, somewhere between the jagged spine of the Arizona Territory and the unforgiving vastness of New Mexico, did not welcome strangers. It tolerated them only long enough to kill them. Dust choked the air. It was a fine, red powder that settled into the creases of Elias's skin, coated his tongue, and clogged the action of the Winchester rifle scabbarded beneath his leg. He reached for his canteen, unscrewed the cap, and tilted it. A single drop, warm and tasting of tin, rolled onto his cracked lip. He swallowed dryly and capped it again. "Easy, boy," Elias murmured, his voice a rasping croak. "Just a few more miles. Maybe there is shade in that canyon." The canyon in question was a jagged tear in the earth ahead of them, a maw of shadow cutting through the red rock mesas. It promised relief from the sun, but Elias knew better than to trust promises made by this country. He scanned the rim rock, his gaze methodical. Skeletal mesquite bushes clawed at the air, their twisted branches offering no cover. Prickly pear cactus huddled against the stones like armored tortoises. He urged the horse forward. The animal blew hard, its head drooping. As they entered the mouth of the canyon, the temperature dropped, but the air grew heavy, silent in a way that made the hair on the back of Elias's neck stand up. The silence was not empty. It was holding its breath. The attack did not begin with a scream. It began with the sharp, flat crack of a rifle echoing off the canyon walls. Dust kicked up inches from the roan's front hoof. The horse reared, screaming in panic, twisting violently. Elias fought the reins, but the animal was weak and terrified. Another shot rang out, chipping stone near Elias's head. "Down!" Elias shouted, kicking his feet free of the stirrups as the horse buckled. He hit the ground hard, the impact jarring his teeth. He rolled instinctively, scrambling behind a slab of fallen sandstone. The roan had gone down, thrashing in the dust, a dark stain spreading on its flank. Elias cursed, a low, bitter sound, and jerked his Colt from its holster. He peered over the rock. There was movement in the thorny brush up the slope. A flash of bronze skin, a strip of red cloth. Apaches. They were not attacking in a wave. They were hunting him, pinning him down. A bullet whined off the rock face inches from his ear, sending stone splinters into his cheek. Elias fired back, blindly aiming at the powder smoke drifting from the creosote bushes. He saw a figure dart from one boulder to another, moving with the fluidity of water. Elias tracked him, cocking the hammer. He exhaled, steadying his hand. Then he saw the child, a boy, no older than 10, had scrambled up from the wash, perhaps flushing the game for the warriors. The boy stood frozen in the open, eyes wide, staring at the white man with the gun. Behind the boy, on the ridge, a warrior raised a rifle, aiming not at Elias, but providing cover fire that would likely cut right through the space where the boy stood if Elias fired back. Elias hesitated. In that split second, the instinct to kill warred with something older, something softer that he thought he had buried years ago. He did not pull the trigger. He shifted his aim, firing into the air to startle the boy back into cover. "Go!" Elias roared. The distraction cost him. A shadow detached itself from the rocks to his left. He turned, but he was too slow. A heavy blow struck the side of his head, indifferent and massive, like a falling timber. The world tilted sideways, the red rock, the blue sky, and the choking dust swirled into a single gray funnel. The last thing he heard was the groaning of his dying horse and the crunch of boots on gravel. Then there was nothing. Consciousness returned in fragments, sharp and disjointed. First came the smell, It was the scent of wood smoke, pungent and clinging, mixed with the copper tang of blood and the earthy aroma of roasted agave. Then came the pain. It throbbed at his temple and burned in his shoulder. His left arm felt heavy, useless. Elias opened his eyes. The light had changed. The blinding white of noon had faded into the bruised purple of twilight. He was lying on hard-packed earth. He tried to move his hands and found them bound tightly behind his back with rawhide that bit into his wrists. He was in a camp. It was tucked deep into a fold of the canyon, invisible from the high ground. Low structures made of brush and bent saplings, wickiups, were scattered around a central fire pit. Strips of meat hung from wooden racks, drying in the dry air. A few horses were picketed near the far wall of the canyon, heads low. People moved through the twilight. Women in long calico skirts and buckskin overtunics tended the fires or worked hides. Men, their hair bound in cloth headbands, sat sharpening knives or checking rifles. They looked lean, hard, their faces stamped with the weariness of a people who had been running for a long time. Elias shifted, gritting his teeth against the pain in his head. A few children who had been standing near him, watching with wide, dark eyes, scrambled back as if he were a waking bear. One of the warriors noticed him moving. He said something sharp in a language that sounded like wind scraping over stone. A moment later, an older woman approached. She was small but carried herself with the stillness of a hawk. Her face was a map of deep lines, her hair streaked with gray and tied back severely. She wore a heavy necklace of beads and shells. This was Sansi. Elias did not know her name yet, but he knew her type. In every outfit, in every town, and in every tribe, there was always one person who held the true weight of authority. Regardless of who carried the weapons, she was that person. She looked down at him, her expression unreadable. Beside her stood a younger woman. Elias's breath caught in his throat for a second. The younger woman was striking, though not in a way that suggested softness. She was tall, her posture rigid. She wore a buckskin skirt and a faded blue soldier's shirt that had been remade to fit her. Her hair was loose, falling around a face that was beautiful, but marred by a hardness in the eyes that chilled him. A thin, pale scar ran from her jawline down her neck, disappearing into her collar. The older woman, Sansi, spoke to the warrior who had approached. The warrior gestured angrily at Elias, making a slashing motion across his throat. He pointed to the north, then to Elias, spitting words that carried the heat of an accusation. Spy, soldier, thief. Sansi listened, her face impassive. When the warrior finished, she spoke. Her voice was low, raspy, but it cut through the man's anger. She pointed a gnarled finger at Elias's shoulder. Elias looked down. His shirt was torn, and a bandage of crushed leaves and cloth had been bound over a graze he hadn't realized he had taken. The younger woman, the one with the scar, stepped forward. She looked at Elias with undisguised contempt. "She says you are a fool," the young woman said. Her English was clear, accented but sharp. Elias blinked, his mouth dry. "I have been called worse. Ma'am." The warrior barked a laugh that held no humor. He spoke again, urging Sansi. The young woman translated without looking at Elias. "He says you are a scout for the Bluecoats, that you led them here. He says we should cut your throat and leave you for the coyotes before the moon rises." "I ain't no scout," Elias croaked. "I was riding alone. My horse, dead," the woman said flatly. "Good meat." Sansi spoke again, silencing the warrior with a sharp look. She gestured to the edge of the camp, where the boy Elias had seen earlier was sitting, watching them. The boy held a piece of honeycomb, untouched. Sansi mimed a shooting motion, then pointed to Elias, then to the boy. The young woman's expression flickered. For a second, the mask of cold hostility slipped, revealing something confused. She looked at Elias, really looked at him. For the first time, "My mother-in-law, Sansi, saw what you did," the young woman said. "She says a soldier would have shot the boy to get a clear line at the warrior. You fired high. You took a bullet to the shoulder because you hesitated. I ain't in the habit of shooting children." Elias said, The warrior spat on the ground near Elias's boot and stalked away, clearly unsatisfied but unwilling to defy the matriarch. Sansi said something to the young woman, a long, flowing sentence that ended with a gesture toward the fire. "You will live," the young woman said, her voice returning to its icy calm. "For now. Sansi says you are a guest, a captive guest. If you try to run, we will kill you. If you signal the soldiers, we will kill you." "Who are you?" Elias asked. "I am Nalin," she said. She turned to leave, dismissing him as one might dismiss a stray dog. "Wait," Elias struggled to sit up, fighting the dizziness. "Why? Why keep me?" Nalin stopped. She looked back over her shoulder, the firelight catching the scar on her neck. "Because we are not like you. We do not kill those who save our children, even if they are white devils." Night settled over the canyon like a heavy blanket. The temperature plummeted, the trapped heat of the day vanishing into the thin air. The camp quieted, the sounds of labor replaced by the murmur of voices and the crackle of the fire. Elias had been moved closer to the main fire, though his hands remained tied. His shoulder throbbed with a dull, persistent rhythm. He was hungry, his stomach twisting into knots, but he said nothing. He watched the women. They were the engine of this place. While the men rested or checked the perimeter, the women worked. They mended clothes, ground seeds on flat stones, and fed the children. It was a scene of domesticity that felt jarringly normal against the backdrop of his violent capture. Sansi sat nearest the fire, working a bone needle through a piece of stiff hide. Nalin sat beside her, sorting through a pile of roots. Other women, younger and older, formed a circle. They spoke softly, occasionally laughing. Elias felt their eyes on him, assessing, judging. Sansi looked up from her work. She fixed Elias with her dark, glittering eyes. She said something to the group, her voice loud enough for him to hear. A ripple of laughter went through the circle. The younger women covered their mouths, giggling and looking at Elias with amused, shy glances. Elias shifted uncomfortably. "What is she saying?" he asked, looking at Nalin. Nalin did not look up from the roots in her lap. "She says you look like a plucked chicken, skinny and pale." The laughter grew louder as Sansi added another comment, this one accompanied by a sly grin. She gestured to Elias. Then, sweeping her hand toward the women, Elias felt the heat rising in his neck. What was that? What did she say? Nalin sighed, dropping a root into a basket. She looked at him, her dark eyes narrowing. She paused, as if weighing how much to tell him. Then, a strange glint appeared in her gaze, a mix of malice and amusement. "She speaks of the law of the guest," Nalin said. "She says that Apache custom requires that the guest must delight all the women of the tribe." Elias froze. The blood rushed to his face so fast it made him dizzy. He looked around the circle. The women were smiling, watching him. Sansi was nodding, looking expectant. "Delight?" Elias stammered. He tried to press himself back against the log he was leaning on. "Now, hold on. I am a prisoner. I don't mean no disrespect, ma'am, but I ain't that kind of man." He looked at Nalin, panic rising in his chest. "You tell her I can't. There is a lot of you, and I am wounded, and, well, it just ain't right." The women laughed harder at his stuttering, though they clearly didn't understand his words. They understood his flushed face and his terror. Nalin stared at him. For a moment, she looked genuinely confused by his reaction. Then, realization dawned on her face. Her eyes went wide, and then narrowed into slits of sharp, sudden anger. "You are a fool," she hissed. She stood up, dusting her hands off on her skirt. She walked over to him, looming over his seated form. The firelight cast her shadow long across the dirt. "Do you think we want your body?" she asked, her voice dripping with scorn. She gestured violently at his skinny frame, his dirt-stained clothes. "Look at you. You are weak. You smell of horse and fear. Do you think you are a prize?" Elias blinked, the embarrassment shifting to confusion. "But you said delight." Nalin leaned down, her face inches from his. She smelled of sage and wood smoke. To delight a woman is not to lay with her, white man, she whispered fiercely. In our custom, a man delights a woman by being useful, by working, by listening when she speaks, by protecting the camp so she can sleep without fear, by telling stories that make the children stop crying. She straightened up, looking down her nose at him. You delight us by taking the burden from our backs, not by adding to it? That is what Sansi meant. Elias sat there, stunned. The laughter of the women took on a different tone now, not inviting, but mocking his arrogance. He felt small, smaller than he had felt when the horse fell on him. I misunderstood, Elias mumbled, looking at the ground. Yes, Nayland said, because your kind only knows one way to use a woman. She turned back to the fire and said something to Sansi. The old woman cackled, slapping her knee, and threw a small piece of dried meat at Elias. It landed in the dust by his knee. Eat, Nayland commanded, sitting back down. Tomorrow you will start delighting us, and it will not be pleasant. The days that followed were a blur of exhaustion and pain. True to Nalan's word, the delightful custom of the guest involved labor that would have broken a lesser man. They untied his hands during the day, but a warrior named Chaitan, the one who had wanted to cut his throat, was always watching from a distance, a rifle resting casually across his knees. Elias was put to work hauling water. The spring was a mile up the canyon, a steep, treacherous climb over shifting scree and jagged boulders. He carried 2 heavy jugs woven from reeds and sealed with pitch. The straps dug into his shoulders, aggravating his wound until his entire left side felt like it was on fire. The sun was relentless. It beat down into the canyon, turning the air stagnant and thick. Elias trudged back and forth, his boots sliding on the loose rock. Sweat stung his eyes. His throat felt like it was coated in sandpaper. When he wasn't hauling water, he was chopping wood. The mesquite was hard as iron, twisting the axe handle in his grip with every swing. He dragged the wood back to the camp, stacking it where the women directed. He brushed down the horses, cleaning the grit from their coats until his arms shook with fatigue. He scraped hides, the smell of curing chemicals making his eyes water. Through it all, Nalan watched. She did not help him. She did not speak to him, except to give orders. Faster, she would say as he stumbled with a load of wood. The sun is setting. The fire needs fuel. Or, you missed a spot, pointing at a patch of dust on a horse's flank. But beneath her coldness, Elias sensed a curiosity. She watched how he worked. He did not complain. He did not curse the women. He treated the horses with a gentle, practiced hand, murmuring to them in a low voice that seemed to calm the skittish beasts. When he passed the children, he did not glare at them. He stepped aside to let them pass. He was delighting them, in the way she had described, by becoming a beast of burden so they did not have to be. One afternoon, Elias collapsed near the woodpile. His legs simply gave out. He sat in the dust, his chest heaving, black spots dancing in his vision. Nayland was there a moment later. She stood over him, holding a gourd of water. "Drink," she said. Elias took it with shaking hands. He drank greedily, water spilling down his chin and soaking his dirty shirt. He lowered the gourd, gasping. "Thank you," he rasped. "Do not thank me," Nayland said, her voice devoid of warmth. "A dead mule pulls no wagon." She took the gourd back. Elias looked up at her. The harsh sunlight illuminated the scar on her neck, the fine lines of tension around her mouth. "How did you lose him?" Elias asked quietly. Nayland stiffened. She did not ask who he meant. The ghost of her husband hung around her like a shroud. "Soldiers," she said. The word fell like a stone. "They came at dawn. Like you. They were riding through. They said they were looking for stolen cattle. They found none. They burned the village anyway." Elias looked down at his hands. "They were blistered and raw. I am sorry," he said. Nayland laughed. A brittle sound. "Sorry? What is sorry? Sorry brings back no dead. Sorry rebuilds no wiki-ups." She leaned in, her eyes fierce. "Why are you here? Elias Ward, you are not a soldier. You ride like a man who is running away. What runs behind you?" Elias was silent for a long time. He looked at the canyon walls, rising red and steep around them, trapping them in. "I was with a patrol once," he said, his voice low. "Before I drifted. 1880. Up near the Verde." He paused, the memory rising up, bitter as bile. "We were supposed to be escorting a surveyor, the lieutenant. He wanted a fight. He found a camp, peaceful folks. They were just gathering piñon nuts." Elias swallowed hard. "He ordered us to fire. I didn't shoot. I swear it. I tried to stop the private next to me. I grabbed his rifle barrel. He hit me with the stock. They burned the shelters. I heard the screaming. I saw—" He stopped. He couldn't say it. He couldn't tell her about the woman he saw trapped in the flames, or the way the lieutenant had laughed later, drinking whiskey by the fire. "I left the army the next day." Elias said, "I have been riding ever since, but the riding don't seem to put enough miles between me and that smoke." Nayland stared at him. Her expression didn't soften. Exactly. But the hostility lost its edge. It was replaced by a somber recognition. She knew that look in his eyes. It was the same look she saw in the mirror. "You carry a heavy stone. White man," she said softly. She turned and walked away, leaving him alone with the wood and his ghosts. Night fell again, colder than before. The desert wind had teeth, biting through Elias's thin shirt. He sat near the edge of the firelight, separated from the warmth of the main circle. He was shivering, his body exhausted, his defenses stripped away by the day's labor and the confession he had made. He hugged his knees to his chest, trying to conserve heat. He watched the sparks spiral up into the black sky, joining the millions of stars that looked cold and distant. He felt a presence beside him. Nayland stood there. She held a heavy wool blanket, woven with stripes of red and black. It was old but thick. "Take it," she said. Elias looked up. "I'm fine. You're shaking like a wet dog." She retorted. "Take it. Sansi says if you freeze to death, we have to dig a hole in the rocky ground to bury you. She does not want to dull the shovels." Elias reached out. His hand was trembling. As he took the blanket, his fingers brushed against hers. The contact was brief, a mere grazing of skin against skin, but it felt like a static shock. Elias felt a jolt run up his arm, settling in his chest. He looked up, startled. Nayland pulled her hand back as if she had been burned. Her eyes locked with his. For a heartbeat. The guard was down. There was no anger, no history, no war. Just a man and a woman in the dark, cold and lonely. The air between them seemed to vibrate. Elias saw the pulse jump in her throat. He saw the way her lips parted slightly. A breath hitched in her chest. Then the moment shattered. Nayland stepped back, her face closing up like a fortress gate slamming shut. She wrapped her arms around herself, turning her gaze away from him, toward the dark mouth of the canyon. "Sleep, guest," she said, her voice tight. "Tomorrow there is more wood to chop." She walked away quickly, disappearing into the shadows of the wickiups. Elias wrapped the blanket around his shoulders. It smelled of her, sage, smoke, and something faint and sweet, like dried flowers. He pulled it tight, the warmth seeping into his bones, but his heart was hammering against his ribs, beating a rhythm that had nothing to do with the cold. Time lost its shape in the canyon. It was measured not in hours or minutes, but in the slant of the sun against the red rock walls and the length of the shadows creeping across the valley floor. Days turned into a week, then two. The rawhide bindings that had chafed Elias Ward's wrists were gone, cut away by Nayland's knife, but the tether remained. It was invisible now, woven from the watchful eyes of the warriors and the unspoken threat of the rifles that were never out of reach. Elias was free to walk the perimeter of the camp, to fetch wood, to climb the scree slopes to the spring. But he knew that if he took one step toward the open desert, a bullet would find him before his boot hit the ground. The life of the tribe was a hard, grinding rhythm. Elias saw it now from the inside. It was an existence pared down to the bone. The men were ghosts, disappearing before dawn to scout for game or soldiers, returning with faces mask-like with dust and fatigue. Sometimes they brought a deer, lean and stringy. Sometimes they brought only a handful of rabbits. The women carried the world. Elias watched them as he worked. They scraped hides with bone tools, their arms corded with muscle, turning the stiff skins into soft buckskin amidst the sharp, pungent smell of curing agents. They spent hours foraging in the rocky wash, digging for tubers and agave hearts with sharpened sticks. Water was the god they served. Every drop was counted. When a gourd spilled, the silence that followed was heavy with tragedy. The land itself seemed determined to scour them from the earth. Dust storms swept through the canyon with no warning. Towering walls of red grit that blotted out the sun and turned day into a choking twilight. During these storms, everyone huddled in the wickiups, handkerchiefs or scraps of cloth pressed to their faces, listening to the wind howl like a dying animal. One morning, after a particularly brutal storm had scoured the camp, Sansi found Elias clearing drift sand from the fire pit. The matriarch leaned on a walking stick, her eyes bright and bird-like in her weathered face. She pointed a gnarled finger toward a large, flat-grinding stone, a matete, that had cracked down the center. "The women need flour," Sansi said. Her English was broken, picked up from years of trading and conflict, but her meaning was clear. Elias looked at the stone. It was heavy basalt, useless in 2 pieces. "Can I not just find another?" Sansi shook her head. "Good stone is rare. Fix this one, or make a new one smooth. The guest delights by making the tool work, so the woman's back does not break." Elias set to work. He found a deposit of river clay near the dried wash and mixed it with resin from the pinyon pines. Heating the mixture carefully, he used it to bind the stone, then spent hours grinding the seam down with sand and water until it was smooth as glass. When he presented it to the woman who owned it, a young mother named Elu, she ran her hand over the repair, her eyes widening. She looked at Elias, then at the stone, and gave a shy, quick nod of approval. It began there. The custom, which Elias had first feared was a crude demand, revealed itself to be a complex web of service. He was the extra pair of hands where they were needed most. He carried the heaviest logs for the fires, sparing the grandmothers. He repaired the rietas, the rawhide ropes, braiding them tight and strong. One afternoon, the children were restless, the heat was oppressive, and the mothers were exhausted. A group of boys were throwing stones at a lizard, their voices rising in irritated squabbles. Elias, sitting in the shade mending a bridle, looked up. He whistled, a sharp, 2-note sound that cut through the heat. The boys stopped. Elias picked up a piece of dried mesquite root he had been whittling. With a few deft turns of his wrist, he made the small wooden figure dance between his fingers, flipping it over his knuckles. The boys crept closer. Elias did not look at them directly. He made the wooden man jump from one hand to the other. "Do it again," one of the braver boys demanded. Elias smiled faintly, the skin crinkling around his eyes. He did it again, faster this time. Then he handed the wood and the small knife to the boy. "You try," Elias said. "Keep the blade away from your thumb." By evening, half the children in the camp were sitting around him as he showed them how to carve simple shapes or tie knots that would not slip. The mothers watched from the fires, their shoulders lowering an inch. The constant tension of childcare eased for a precious hour. Nalin watched all of this from a distance. She stood with her arms crossed over her chest, her posture rigid. She saw the way Elu smiled when the grinding stone held. She saw the children laughing. She saw the way the other women had stopped looking at Elias with fear and started looking at him with something that bordered on appreciation. It irritated her. It felt like a betrayal of the vigilance they needed to survive. "He is just a man," she muttered to herself as she scraped a deer hide. "A white man. He will turn like a snake when the time comes." But she could not stop watching him. The shift happened on a Tuesday, or what Elias reckoned was a Tuesday. The evening meal was finished, a thin stew of rabbit and roots. The fire had burned down to glowing coals. The camp was quiet. The only sounds the settling of the horses and the distant cry of a coyote. Elias reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, battered object. It was a Honer mouth harp, the metal tarnished and dented. He tapped it against his palm to clear the dust. He glanced around the circle. The warriors were at the far end of the camp. gambling with marked sticks. The women were closer, resting. Naylin was seated on a log, her face in shadow. Elias lifted the harp to his lips. He cupped his hands around it and blew softly. The sound was thin and reedy at first, wavering in the vast silence of the canyon. Then, he found the rhythm. He didn't play a raucous trail song or a dance hall jig. He played something slow, a melody that rose and fell like the wind over the prairie. It was the Dying Cowboy, a tune full of loneliness and open space. The camp went still. The low hum of conversation among the women ceased. The scraping of tools stopped. Even the dogs seemed to lift their heads. The notes floated up toward the stars, mournful and sweet, speaking of loss and the long, hard road. Elias closed his eyes, swaying slightly. For a moment, he wasn't a prisoner. He was back on the night watch in Wyoming, or riding the fence line in Texas, alone with the sky. He poured his own exhaustion, his guilt, and his confused longing into the metal reeds. When he finished, the silence stretched out, heavy and thick. Then, Sansi sighed. It was a long, rattling exhalation. "Good," she said. "That is a good sound. It cries like the rain." A young woman near her wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. Then, surprisingly, she laughed, a soft, watery sound. "It makes me think of the time before the soldiers," she said. "When we danced." Elias wiped the harp on his shirt. "I know a few others," he said quietly. "Play," Sansi commanded. He played Shenandoah. He played Hard Times Come Again No More. As the music wove through the smoke, the atmosphere in the camp shifted. The hard edge of survival softened. Shoulders relaxed. A few of the women hummed along, low in their throats, a harmony that didn't match the melody but somehow fit it perfectly. Naylin remained in the shadows. She felt as if a hand were squeezing her heart. The sound of the harp dug up memories she had buried under layers of anger and iron. It reminded her of the winter camp. 3 years ago, her husband, Coda, had not played a harp, but he had sung. He had a deep, rumbling voice that vibrated in his chest when she laid her head against him. He used to sing to their son, bouncing the baby on his knee near the fire. She looked at Elias. The firelight flickered on his face, softening the sharp angles of his jaw, highlighting the dust in his hair. He looked gentle. The anger flared hot in her chest, a defense against the grief. How dare he? How dare he bring this softness here? Softness was death. If they remembered how to be soft, the winter would kill them. The soldiers would kill them. She stood up abruptly, her movement jarring in the peaceful scene. She turned and walked into the darkness, her moccasins making no sound. Elias saw her go. He lowered the harp, the last note hanging unresolved in the air. The next afternoon, the heat broke slightly, replaced by a gusty wind that smelled of ozone and wet stone. Elias was working on the lower slope of the canyon wall, repairing a makeshift corral where the tribe kept their few spare horses. The fence was a haphazard collection of piled stones and mesquite branches, and the recent storms had weakened a section near a steep drop-off. He was wedging a heavy rock into place when he heard a scramble of pebbles. He looked up. A young girl, maybe 6 years old, with hair like black silk, was chasing a lizard near the edge of the ravine. She was laughing, focused entirely on the creature darting between the rocks. The ground near the edge was unstable, undercut by the flash floods of previous years. "Stop!" Elias shouted. The girl turned, startled by his voice. She took a step back, her heel finding nothing but air. The earth crumbled beneath her. She didn't scream. Her eyes just went wide as she slipped. Elias moved without thinking. He dropped the rock and lunged. He hit the ground hard, sliding on his stomach, the sharp stones shredding his shirt and the skin of his forearms. He threw his right arm out over the edge. His hand closed around the girl's wrist just as she went over. The jolt nearly pulled Elias over with her. He grunted, digging the toes of his boots into the gravel, his shoulders screaming in protest. The girl dangled over a 20-foot drop to jagged boulders below. She looked up at him, terrified and silent. "I got you," Elias gasped. "I got you. Hold on." He grit his teeth and pulled. It took every ounce of strength he had left. He dragged her up, scraping her over the lip of the ravine, until they both collapsed onto the safe ground, breathing hard. The girl scrambled away from the edge, shaking. Elias rolled onto his back, staring up at the sky, his chest heaving. A shadow fell over him. He looked up to see Nylund standing there. She had been coming up the path with a basket of roots. She had seen it all. Her face was pale, her eyes wide. She looked from the crumbled edge of the cliff to the girl, then to Elias. The girl ran to Nylund, burying her face in Nylund's skirt. Nylund's hand came up automatically to stroke the child's hair, but her eyes never left Elias. There was no anger in her face now. There was naked terror, the echo of the moment she saw the girl fall, and beneath that, a profound, reluctant gratitude that seemed to pain her physically. Elias sat up, wincing as he checked his bleeding arms. "She is all right," Elias said, his voice rough. "Just a scare." Nylund swallowed. Her throat worked. She looked at the girl, tracing the line of her small shoulder, assuring herself she was whole. It was the same motion she must have used 1,000 times with her own child. "You—" Nylund started, but the word choked off. She looked at Elias, and for a second, the barrier between them dissolved. She saw a man who had risked himself for a child not his own. He saw a mother whose heart was a graveyard of lost loves. "Get back to camp," Nylund said, her voice trembling but gaining strength. "Get her back. The wind is picking up." She turned the girl toward the wickiups and gave her a gentle push. Then she looked back at Elias. "Thank you," she whispered. The words sounded like they were torn out of her. She turned and followed the child, walking fast, as if fleeing the scene of a crime. That night, the wind howled through the canyon, rattling the brush walls of the shelters. Elias could not sleep. His arms burned where the rocks had cut him, and his mind was racing. He got up and walked to the dying embers of the central fire. A figure was sitting there, illuminated by the faint red glow. It was Nylund. She held a large hunting knife and a whetstone. Scritch, scritch, scritch. The rhythmic sound of steel on stone was hypnotic and aggressive. Elias approached slowly. "Do you ever sleep?" he asked softly. Nylund did not look up. "Sleep is for those who are safe." Elias sat down on a log opposite her, keeping a respectful distance. "You are sharpening that blade like you expect to use it tonight." "I use it every day," she said, "to cut meat, to cut hide, to cut throats, if I must." Elias watched the firelight play on her features. She was beautiful, he realized again, with a fierce, terrifying beauty that made his chest ache. "You have family?" Elias asked. "Before Coda? Before the boy?" Nylund's hand froze. The knife stopped moving. She looked up, her eyes flashing dangerous fire. "Do not speak their names," she hissed. "I didn't mean disrespect," Elias said, holding up his hands. I saw you today. With the girl, you have a mother's heart. Nylund, even if you try to hide it behind a knife." Nylund stood up so fast the log she was sitting on rolled back. She pointed the knife at him, not threatening to stab, but as an extension of her fury. "You know nothing of my heart, white man," she said, her voice low and venomous. "You think because you fixed a stone and saved a clumsy girl, you know us, you know me? I see you," Elias said, standing up to face her. "I see you hurting. Stop it." Nylund stepped closer, the knife trembling in her hand. "Do not try to be kind to me. Do not try to understand. Your people. You come with your smiles and your treaties, and then you bring the whiskey and the pox and the bullets." She was shaking. It wasn't rage. Elias realized it was panic. She was terrified that if she let him in, if she let herself feel gratitude or warmth, the universe would punish her by taking it away. "I ain't my people," Elias said steadily, "and I ain't asking for nothing." "You are like all of them," she spat, tears of frustration welling in her eyes. "You look at us and you see ghosts. You see victims. I am not a victim. I am Apache. I am iron." She was shouting now, over the wind. "If I soften, I die," she cried. "If I love, I lose. So do not ask about my family. Do not ask about my dead. They are mine." She turned away, breathing hard, her shoulders heaving. Elias stood silent. He wanted to reach out to her, to comfort her, but he knew that to touch her now would be like touching a live wire. "I won't ask again," he said softly. He turned and walked back to his sleeping spot, leaving her alone with the fire and her knife. The trouble arrived the next day at noon. Elias was near the mouth of the canyon, gathering dry sage for the fires. He was further out than usual, but the guard, Chayton, had grown lax. Sitting in the shade of a boulder 50 yards back, the wind carried the sound before the sight. Voices, loud, brash, speaking English. The creak of leather and the jingle of bit chains. Elias froze. He dropped to a crouch behind a cluster of creosote bushes. He peered through the branches, down in the main wash, about 200 yards away. 3 riders were moving slowly. They were leading 2 pack mules heavily laden with goods. Traders. Elias squinted. The man in the lead was big, wearing a greasy duster and a hat with a snakeskin band. He had a beard that covered half his chest and a laugh that sounded like gravel in a tin bucket. Silas Cobb. Elias felt a cold knot form in his stomach. He knew Silas. 2 years ago, in a saloon in Lordsburg, Silas had been the one to accuse Elias of being an Indian lover because Elias had refused to drink a toast to a massacre. Silas had called him a traitor then. Silas was talking to the man beside him. "Tell you, the tracks are fresh," Silas was saying. "Army pays $20 a head for information. If they're holed up in these rocks, we just mark the spot and ride to Fort Bayard. Easy money." The second man spat. "I don't see nothing." "Silas, just rocks and heat. They're here," Silas insisted. "I can smell 'em, like smoke and sour grease." He pulled a strip of red cloth from his saddlebag and tied it to a mesquite branch, a marker, a sign for the cavalry patrol that would be following close behind. Elias's heart hammered. If the soldiers found the canyon, it would be a slaughter. The tribe was low on ammunition, starving, and trapped. He waited until the traders rode past, heading further down the wash. Then he turned and ran. He scrambled up the slope, ignoring the thorns tearing at his legs. He reached Chayton, who jumped up, rifle raised. "Soldiers!" Elias gasped. "Or men bringing them. Traders. Down in the wash. They marked the trail." Chayton stared at him, suspicious. "You saw them?" "I know them," Elias said urgently. "We have to warn Sansi. They ran back to the camp." Elias burst into the circle, chest heaving. "Pack up," he shouted. "You have to move. Soldiers are coming." The camp erupted into chaos. Warriors grabbed weapons. Women gathered children. Sansi emerged from her wickiup, calm amidst the storm. "What is this?" she demanded. Elias explained quickly. The words tumbling out: Silas Cobb, the red marker, the Fort Bayard patrol. As he spoke, several warriors gathered around. One of them, a tall man with a scar across his nose, looked at Elias with narrowing eyes. Then he looked at Chayton. "He was out there," the warrior said, "near the mouth. How do we know he did not signal them?" The mood in the circle shifted instantly. Fear turned to paranoia. The warriors looked at Elias. He was the white man, the enemy. The coincidence was too great. "He called them," the warrior shouted, drawing a long knife. "He is a spy. We should have killed him the first day." The warriors surged forward. Elias backed up, raising his hands. "No, I swear it." "I'm trying to help you." The warrior lunged. "Stop!" It was a wall of voices. Sansi stepped forward, planting her staff between Elias and the blade. But she was not alone. Elu was there. The grandmother whose wood Elias carried was there. Even the young girl he had saved stood behind them. The women of the tribe formed a human barrier around the guest. "He fixed the stone," Elu said, her voice high but firm. "He carries the water. He plays the music that makes us remember," the grandmother said. "He is not a spy." Sansi said, her voice like cracking thunder. "He is a guest, and he has delighted us with his labor. We do not kill those who serve us." The warrior hesitated, the knife hovering inches from Sansi's face. "He is white," he snarled. Then a voice cut through the tension like a whip. "He speaks the truth." Nalin stepped through the circle of warriors. She walked until she stood next to Elias. She did not look at him. She looked straight at the warrior with the knife. "I saw his face when he returned," Nalin said. "It was the face of a man afraid, not for himself, but for us." She took a breath, and Elias saw her hand clench into a fist at her side. "I trust him," she said. The words hung in the air, impossible and heavy. Nalin, the widow who hated white men, the woman of iron, had spoken for him. The warrior stared at her, then at Sansi. He spat on the ground, sheathed his knife, and turned away. "Pack the camp," he shouted to the others. "If the soldiers are coming, we ride." The camp was a frenzy of activity as the sun began to set. They were preparing to move at first light, to slip away into the deeper mountains. Elias found Nalin near the horses. She was checking a cinch, her movements jerky and angry. "Nalin," Elias said. "She didn't turn. Go away. You saved my life." He said, "You stood for me." She spun around. Her eyes were wild. "I stood for the tribe. If they killed you, it would have delayed us. We would have fought among ourselves." "Is that the only reason?" Elias asked. He stepped closer. Nalin looked up at him. The moon was rising, casting a pale, silver light over the canyon. It washed out the color of her skin and made her eyes look like pools of shadow. "Why did you come back?" she whispered. "Why didn't you run to the traders? You could have gone home." Elias looked at her. He thought of the world outside, the dusty towns, the angry men like Silas Cobb, the loneliness of the trail. "I have no home," Elias said. He took another step. They were close now, too close. He could feel the heat radiating from her body. "And I couldn't let them hurt you," he said. Nalin let out a shaky breath. "You are a fool. Elias Ward, a dangerous fool." She looked at his mouth. He looked at hers. The air between them was charged, electric with the adrenaline of the day and the fear of the tomorrow. The pull was physical, a magnetic force dragging them together against all reason. Elias reached out. His hand hovered near her face, wanting to touch the scar, wanting to smooth the worry from her brow. Nalin leaned in, just a fraction of an inch. Her lips parted. Then she gasped, as if waking from a dream. She jerked back, stumbling slightly on the rocks. "No," she said. Her voice was a plea. "No." She looked at him one last time, a look of longing and terror, and then she turned and ran into the darkness, leaving him standing alone in the cold moonlight, his hands still reaching for something he could not hold. The wind changed first. It was no longer the hot, dry breath of the furnace that defined the summer months. Now, it carried a thin, biting edge, a precursor to the killing frosts that would soon descend from the high peaks. It whispered through the skeletal branches of the mesquite and rattled the dry pods of the yucca, sounding like the shaking of bone dice in a gambler's cup. The scouts returned on a gray, overcast morning, their horses lathered and trembling. They did not ride into camp with the boisterous energy of a successful hunt. They rode with their heads low, their eyes scanning the back trail. Elias stood near the woodpile, his axe resting against his leg. He watched them speak to the elders. He did not need to know the language to read the set of their shoulders. The news was bad. Later, Nalin came to him. She looked thinner than she had a week ago. The stress was carving the hollows of her cheeks deeper, making her eyes look immense and dark. "The blue coats are everywhere," she said, her voice flat. "They are sweeping the valleys to the south. General Crook has sent more men. They are burning everything they cannot carry. They are pushing the people toward the reservation at San Carlos." "And those who don't go?" Elias asked. Nalin looked at the horizon. "They are killing them." The mood in the camp shifted from wary survival to a frantic, low-level panic. The food stores were dangerously low. The summer rains had been stingy, and the harvest of agave and nuts was poor. Now, with the soldiers closing a ring of steel around the territory, the traditional winter hunting grounds were cut off. Sansi, the matriarch, found Elias sharpening his knife by the fire. She kicked his boot with her moccasined toe. "Up," she commanded. Elias stood. He towered over her, but she held the authority of a mountain. "The time for playing songs is over, guest." Sansi said. Her English was getting better, or perhaps she was just using words that were sharper. The winter comes, the soldiers come. If we are to live, the women cannot carry the burden alone. You must be strong. You must be a mule. You must be a wolf. She pointed to the north, toward the high, broken ridges of the Dragoon Mountains. Meat, she said. The custom says you delight us. Delight us by keeping our children from starving. Elias nodded. I will do what I can. Ma'am? He did not know then that he was agreeing to a torture that would strip him raw. The next 2 weeks were a blur of exhaustion that made his previous labor seem like a holiday. The tribe was preparing for a siege, or a long flight, and every scrap of resource had to be gathered. Elias went out with the hunting parties. They did not give him a gun. Trust had not extended that far, but they gave him a heavy pack frame made of ash wood and rawhide. He became the carrier. When they killed a mule deer high in the rocks, it was Elias who quartered it and carried the bulk of the meat down slopes that were little more than vertical slides of shale. His boots, already worn, began to split at the seams. He wrapped them in raw hide to keep them together. His hands, accustomed to the work of a cowboy, cracked open in the dry cold. Fissures appeared on his knuckles and fingertips, bleeding when he gripped the rough rope of the pack or the handle of the axe. He learned to read the ground. Chaitin, the warrior who had once wanted to kill him, became a begrudging teacher. Chaitin would point to a disturbance in the dust, a bent twig, a smear of droppings. Look, Chaitin would grunt. Elias would look. At first, he saw nothing, but slowly, his eyes adjusted. He learned to see the passage of a coyote, the scuff of a deer's hoof, the heavy, booted print of a soldier. One evening, Elias stumbled back into camp carrying a load of firewood that would have buckled a horse. He dropped it near the central fire and sank to his knees, his breath rasping in his chest. Nalin was there. She was stirring a pot of thin broth. She looked at him, at his bleeding hands, at the gray pallor of his skin under the dirt. You are bleeding, she said. Elias looked at his hands as if they belonged to someone else. It is nothing. It is not nothing, she said. If the infection takes you, we cannot spare the medicine to save you. She fetched a small clay pot of salve made from animal fat and crushed sage. She took his hand in hers. Her fingers were cool and rough, but her touch was gentle. She rubbed the salve into the cracks of his skin. The sting was sharp, followed by a dull, throbbing heat. Elias watched her head, bent over his hand. He could see the part in her dark hair, the vulnerable curve of her neck. He felt a lump form in his throat. Why do you do this? He asked quietly. You hate me. Nayland did not look up. I do not hate you. Elias, then what? He asked. I fear you, she whispered. She dropped his hand and moved back to the fire, leaving him with the smell of sage and the burning memory of her touch. The sky was the color of a bruised plum when the hunting party set out 3 days later. It was Elias, Nalin, Chaitin, and a younger boy named Goyath. They were heading for a box canyon 2 days' ride to the east, a place where the old men said elk sometimes wintered. The terrain was unforgiving. It was a landscape of sharp edges, volcanic rock that tore at clothes and skin, cacti that seemed to reach out to snag them. They moved in silence, eyes scanning the ridges for the silhouette of an animal or the glint of a rifle barrel. By mid-afternoon, the air grew heavy. The wind died completely, leaving a silence that felt oppressive. Storm. Chaitin grunted, looking at the horizon. A wall of darkness was building in the west. It wasn't rain, it was dust, a haboob, a solid mountain of grit and wind that could strip the paint off a wagon. We need cover, Nayland said. They were in a narrow wash, exposed. Chaitin pointed to a cluster of rocks halfway up the canyon wall. There, he shouted. The wind hit them a second later. It didn't build, it arrived all at once. A physical blow that nearly knocked Elias off his feet. The sky turned black, the air turned to sandpaper. Visibility dropped to the length of an arm. Run! Elias yelled, though he couldn't even hear his own voice over the roar. They scrambled up the slope. The dust blinded them, stinging their eyes and filling their mouths. Elias reached out, grabbing for a handhold, finding only loose rock. He slipped, sliding back down. "Elias!" It was Nalin's voice, faint and terrified. He lunged forward, squinting against the grit. He saw a shape in the swirling brown darkness. Nalin was crouching near a fissure in the rock face, waving to him. He clawed his way up to her. Chayton and the boy had vanished into the storm, likely finding shelter further up the ridge. "In here!" Nalin shouted, grabbing his coat. She pulled him into a shallow overhang, a hollow scooped out of the canyon wall by centuries of water and wind. It was small, barely deep enough for two people to sit if they pulled their knees to their chests. They collapsed into the back of the hollow, gasping for air. Outside, the world had ceased to exist. There was only the roar of the wind and the hiss of sand striking stone. It sounded like 1,000 snakes hissing at once. Elias pulled his bandana up over his nose and mouth. He wrapped his arms around his knees, shivering. The temperature had dropped 20 degrees in minutes. Nalin was pressed against him. There was nowhere else for her to be. Her shoulder dug into his ribs. He could feel her trembling, a constant, fine vibration that traveled through her body to his. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice muffled by the cloth. "No," she said. She sounded small. They sat in the dark for a long time. The storm showed no sign of breaking. The dust swirled at the mouth of their cave, a brown curtain that cut them off from the rest of the universe. Elias was hyper-aware of her, the warmth of her leg against his, the smell of her damp hair, the way her breathing hitched every few minutes. He shifted, trying to give her more room. But his boot hit the back wall. "We are stuck," he said. "Yes," Nalin said. She pulled her blanket tighter around her shoulders. She was staring out into the storm, her eyes wide and unseeing. "This is how it was," she said suddenly. Her voice was strange, detached. "What?" Elias asked. "The dust," she said. "The confusion. But it was not wind. It was smoke." Elias went still. He knew she was talking about the raid. He didn't ask her to stop. He sensed that the storm had unlocked something in her, that the claustrophobia of the cave was squeezing the poison out. "Tell me," he said softly. Nalin closed her eyes. It was morning, she said. "We were camped near the river. The water was high. My husband, Coda, had just gone to check the horses. I was nursing the baby." She paused, taking a ragged breath. "I heard the shots. They sounded like popping wood. Then the screaming started. I ran out of the wickiup. The soldiers were riding through the camp. They were firing at everything. The tents, the dogs, the people running." She shuddered, a violent spasm that shook her whole frame. "I ran toward the river. I thought if I could get across, I could hide in the willows. I saw Coda. He was running toward me. He had his rifle, but he was not shooting. He was reaching for us." Tears began to leak from her closed eyes, tracking through the dust on her face. "A soldier rode between us," she continued, her voice breaking. "He had a saber. He swung it. Coda fell. He didn't make a sound. He just fell." Elias felt a sick feeling in his gut. He wanted to cover his ears, but he couldn't. He had to witness this. "I kept running," Nalin whispered. "I ran into the water. The current was strong. I slipped. The baby. The blanket was wet. I tried to hold him up. I tried so hard. But the water, it took him. It just took him." She buried her face in her hands. "I washed up on the bank a mile down. I was alive. They were dead. I should have died with them. Why did I not die?" The question hung in the small space, heavy and unanswerable. Elias reached out. He didn't think about it. He placed his hand on her shoulder. She didn't pull away. She leaned into his touch, starved for comfort. "I know," Elias rasped. "You cannot know," Nalin sobbed. "You are white. Your people do the killing." Elias looked at the swirling dust. 1880, he said. The date felt like a confession. Nalin stopped crying. She lifted her head, looking at him. "I told you I was in the army," Elias said. "I told you about the smoke, but I didn't tell you the rest." He swallowed, his throat dry as dust. "We hit a camp at dawn, just like you said. The lieutenant wanted glory. He ordered us to torch the shelters. We threw torches onto the dry brush. Elias looked at his hands, the scarred, cracked hands that had carried wood and water for weeks. I heard a child crying inside one of them. He said, "A little girl. I could hear her coughing. I ran to the flap. I tried to pull it open. The heat was awful. My eyebrows singed off." He looked at Nayland. I got my hand on her arm. I felt her. She was so small. I pulled, but the roof collapsed. The burning brush fell on us. I tried to hold on. Nayland, I swear to God, I tried, but the fire, it was too hot. A sergeant grabbed me by the belt and dragged me back. He hit me. He said to let it burn. Elias's voice cracked. I let go. I let go of her arm, and I stood there and watched it burn. I have felt her hand in mine every day for 5 years. Silence filled the cave, deeper and heavier than the storm outside. They were two broken things, jagged edges fitting together in the dark. Nayland reached out. Her hand was trembling violently. She touched the scar on Elias's shoulder, the place where the bullet had grazed him weeks ago. Her fingers traced the ridge of healed skin. You carry the fire, she whispered. And you carry the water, Elias said. She looked at his face. Her eyes were searching, looking for the monster she had been taught to see, but finding only a reflection of her own pain. The hate that had sustained her for so long began to crumble, leaving her defenseless. We are just ghosts. Elias, she said softly. Maybe, he said, but ghosts don't feel cold. He brushed a strand of dark hair from her face. His knuckles grazed her cheek. Her skin was warm, alive. Nayland made a small, choked sound. She didn't pull back. She leaned forward. The distance between them vanished. The kiss wasn't graceful. It wasn't the romance of a dime novel. It was a collision. It was desperate and shaky, tasting of salt and dust and old grief. It was a frantic attempt to prove that they were still alive, that their hearts could still beat for something other than fear. Nayland gripped his coat, her fingers digging in hard enough to bruise. Elias held her face, his thumbs stroking her cheekbones. The hunger that rose up between them was terrifying in its intensity. It was a fire built from the wreckage of their lives. For a moment, the war didn't exist. The soldiers didn't exist. There was only the heat of their bodies and the desperate, clinging need to be held. Then, just as suddenly, they broke apart. Nayland gasped, pressing her hand to her mouth. She stared at him, her eyes wide with shock. Elias leaned back against the rock, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. Elias started. Nayland shook her head. Do not speak. She pulled her knees up, wrapping her arms around them again, curling into a tight ball. But she didn't move to the far side of the cave. She stayed close to him, their arms touching. They sat in silence as the storm raged itself out. The air in the cave had changed. It was charged, heavy with the weight of what had just happened and the terrifying realization of what it meant. The wind died at sunset. The dust settled slowly, revealing a world painted in monochrome brown. They crawled out of the shelter. The air was crisp and cold now, the sky clearing to a deep, bruised purple. They found Chayton and the boy an hour later. They were safe, huddled under a ledge further up the canyon. They had killed a small deer before the storm hit. The walk back to the main camp the next day was excruciating. Elias walked behind Nayland. He watched the way she moved, the stiffness in her back. Every time they stopped for water, they avoided each other's eyes. But the awareness was constant. It was a physical tether. When Nayland stumbled on a loose rock, Elias's hand shot out to steady her before he even thought about it. She froze at his touch, then nodded a quick, silent thanks. When Elias struggled with the heavy pack, Nayland slowed her pace, silently waiting for him to catch up. It was no longer the dynamic of guard and prisoner. It was something else, something dangerous. They arrived at the camp in the late afternoon. The women greeted them with relief, taking the meat and the firewood. Sonsi was waiting by the fire. She looked at the deer. Then she looked at Nayland and Elias. Her old eyes, sharp as obsidian, darted between them. She saw the dust on their clothes, the exhaustion in their faces, and something else, the tension that vibrated between them like a plucked bowstring. "You found shelter from the wind?" Sansi asked Nalin. "Yes," Nalin said shortly, busying herself with unbuckling the pack from Elias's shoulders. "We found a hole in the rock?" Sansi smirked. "A small hole, I think." Nalin stiffened. It was enough. Sansi chuckled. A dry, rattling sound. "The guest looks different. He looks like a man who has seen a spirit." Or maybe... She paused, her eyes gleaming with mischief. "Maybe he has just been properly delighted." Nalin flushed. The color rose up her neck, visible even under the dust. It was a mix of furious embarrassment and a sudden, terrifying hope that she couldn't suppress. "Old woman," Nalin snapped. "You speak nonsense. The wind has addled your brain." She turned and marched away toward her wickiup, her head high. Sansi watched her go, the smile fading from her face. She looked at Elias. She was no longer joking. "Be careful, white man," she said softly. "Fire warms the lodge, but it also burns it down." The fragile bubble of new feeling did not last long. Reality, grim and bloody, arrived 2 days later. A runner came from the east. He was a Chiricahua, a cousin to one of the women in the band. He came on foot, his moccasins shredded, his body gaunt. He collapsed near the fire, gasping for water. The tribe gathered around him. Elias stood at the back, watching the faces of the people. He saw fear ripple through them like wind through grass. The runner spoke in Apache, his voice cracking with emotion. Nalin stood near the front. Elias watched her. As the man spoke, her hands flew to her mouth. She swayed, as if she had been struck. Elias moved to her side. "What is it?" he asked. "What does he say?" Nalin lowered her hands. Her face was a mask of grief, but her eyes were dry and hard. "The camp at Warm Springs," she said, her voice hollow. "What about it?" "Dead," she said. "All of them." Elias felt the blood drain from his face. "All of them?" "The soldiers came at night. Nalin said they used Gatling guns. They did not ask for surrender. They just mowed them down. Women, children, old men." She looked at Elias. The softness that had begun to grow in the cave was gone, replaced by a wall of ice. "They were my cousins," she said. "My mother's people." Elias reached out a hand, instinctively wanting to comfort her. "Nalin, She stepped back. "Don't!" She looked around the camp. The wailing had started. Women were cutting their hair, tearing their clothes in mourning. The warriors were painting their faces with ash. "This is what your world brings us," Elias, Nalin said. "Death. It brings only death." She looked at him, and for a second, he saw the conflict in her eyes. The memory of the cave, the touch of his hand, warring with the fresh horror of the news. "How can I love you?" she whispered. The words so faint he almost didn't hear them. "How can I love the hand that holds the sword?" She didn't wait for an answer. She turned and joined the circle of mourning women, her voice rising with theirs in a keening song of grief that echoed off the canyon walls. Elias stood alone, the guilt washed over him, old and new. He was innocent of this specific crime, but he wore the skin of the enemy. He looked at his hands, the same hands that had held Nalin's face, the same hands that had failed to save the burning child. He felt the trap closing. The winter was here. The soldiers were coming. And the fragile bridge they had built in the storm was buckling under the weight of the blood spilled in the valley below. He looked up at the rim of the canyon. The sun was setting, turning the sky a violent, bloody red. It looked less like a sunset and more like the world was on fire. The frost did not fall like snow. It grew out of the ground like white mold. It coated the spines of the prickly pear and turned the dry bunchgrass into brittle glass that snapped underfoot. The air lost its smell of dust and sage, replaced by the metallic, empty scent of ice. Winter in the high desert was not asleep. It was a siege. The canyon, once a fortress of red rock and heat, became a wind tunnel. The sun was a pale, distant coin that offered light but no warmth. Food, which had been scarce, became a memory. The deer moved lower, toward the valleys where the soldiers waited, and the rabbits seemed to vanish into the frozen earth. Elias Ward stopped feeling his toes in the early morning of November. He wrapped his boots in strips of raw deer hide, fur side in, but the cold was a living thing that gnawed through leather and wool. He worked until his body was a numb machine. The custom Sansi had joked about, the guest delighting the women, was no longer a joke. It was the difference between life and death. The women were exhausted. Their faces were drawn, skin chapped raw by the wind. Elias took everything he could from them. He spent hours swinging the axe, shattering the iron-hard mesquite wood to keep the fires fed. He woke before dawn to break the ice on the waterholes. He repaired the wickiups, weaving new layers of brush and packing mud into the gaps to keep out the drafting wind. He became the watcher. When the mothers slept, huddled together for warmth under piles of furs, Elias walked the perimeter. He carried a Winchester now, returned to him by the war chief, a silent admission that he was no longer a prisoner but a necessary arm of the tribe's defense. The women noticed. It wasn't just the wood or the water. It was the way he stood between them and the wind. It was the way he lifted the heavy cookpots without being asked. He had ceased to be a white man in their eyes. He had become simply a man who stayed. One afternoon, Elias sat near the entrance of Nalin's shelter, mending a torn blanket. His fingers, calloused and cracked, moved clumsily with a bone needle. Nalin sat opposite him, working on a pair of moccasins. She watched his hands. "You sew like a drunk spider," she said. Her voice was quiet, lacking the bite it once held. Elias chuckled, a low rumble in his chest. "I never claimed to be a seamstress. My talents usually involve rope and branding irons." Nalin reached out. "Let me." She didn't take the blanket from him. Instead, she guided his hands. Her fingers were warm against his cold skin. She adjusted his grip on the needle, showing him how to turn the stitch so it would hold against the strain. "Like this," she said softly. "Tight, so the wind cannot find the hole." Elias looked up. Their faces were inches apart. He could see the gold flecks in her dark eyes, the small fan of wrinkles at the corners that appeared when she squinted against the sun. "You are cold," Elias said. Nalin didn't pull her hand away. "We are all cold. Elias," she ran her thumb over the back of his hand, tracing the line of a vein. "But you," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper, "you work too hard. You give too much meat to the children. I see you. You eat the gristle and leave the flesh for them. They need it more," Elias said. Nalin shook her head slowly. If the wolf starves, the pack dies. The metaphor hung between them. She had called him a wolf, not a dog, not a guest, a wolf, a part of the pack. The stolen moments became their fuel. In a world shrinking due to cold and fear, the space between Elias and Nalin became the only vastness left. They met at the edge of the canyon when the sun began to dip. The sunsets in winter were violent things, streaks of blood red and bruised purple bleeding into the encroaching black. They stood shoulder to shoulder, wrapped in their ragged coats, watching the day die. Nalin spoke of her childhood, of summers in the high meadows where the elk grazed in herds of hundreds. She spoke of the ceremonies, the dances, the way the world used to be before the fences and the forts. Elias spoke of the ocean. He had seen it once, in California, years ago. He described the endless gray water, the way it roared like a beast, the salt spray that tasted like tears. Nalin listened, mesmerized. "Endless water?" she asked. "Enough to drown the world? Enough to wash it clean?" "Maybe," Elias said. His hand found hers in the fold of her blanket. It wasn't an accident anymore. Their fingers interlaced, a desperate knotting of flesh. They stood there until the stars came out, freezing and hungry, kept alive by the terrifying heat of the person standing next to them. But they never crossed the line. The fear was still there, the fear of what it meant, the fear of the doom hanging over them. To love now felt like a defiance of the natural order, a flower trying to bloom on a sheet of ice. It broke on a night when the moon was hidden behind a bank of snow clouds. The camp was silent, save for the coughing of a sick child and the snapping of the fires. Elias was sitting by a small fire he had built near the horse corral, away from the main circle. He was whittling a piece of ash wood, trying to shape a replacement trigger guard for his rifle. He heard the crunch of frost. Naylin stepped into the ring of firelight. She was wrapped in a buffalo robe, her hair loose around her shoulders. She looked wild and regal and incredibly lonely. She didn't say anything. She simply sat down on the log beside him. Elias stopped whittling. He put the knife down. "You should be sleeping," he said. "I cannot sleep." She said, "The silence is too loud." She looked at the fire, the flames reflecting in her eyes. "I keep thinking about the spring," she said. "If we make it, if the soldiers don't come, if the hunger doesn't take us." "We will make it," Elias said firmly. Naylin looked at him. "Do not lie to me. Elias, you know the tracks as well as I do. The circle is closing." She shifted, turning her body toward him. The buffalo robe slipped slightly, revealing the hollow of her throat. "I do not want to die cold," she whispered. Elias felt his heart slam against his ribs. The raw vulnerability in her voice shattered his resolve. "Naylin," he breathed. She reached out and took his face in her hands. Her palms were rough, calloused by work, but to Elias, they felt like silk. She searched his face, looking for the hesitation, the guilt, the white man who had ridden with the burners. She found only the man who had carried the water, the man who had held her in the storm, the man who stayed. She leaned in. Elias met her halfway. The kiss was not like the one in the cave. That had been a collision of grief. This was a collision of life. It was slow, deep, and devastating. It tasted of wood smoke and longing. Naylin's mouth was soft, yielding, and then fierce. She clung to him, her fingers tangling in his long, matted hair, pulling him closer as if she could merge her body with his. Elias wrapped his arms around her, pulling her onto his lap. The buffalo robe enveloped them both. He felt the beat of her heart against his chest, a frantic, strong rhythm that matched his own. He kissed the scar on her neck. He kissed the tears that leaked from the corners of her eyes. He murmured her name against her skin, a litany of worship. "I am here," he whispered. "I am here." Naylin buried her face in the crook of his neck, breathing him in. "Do not leave me," she said, her voice fierce. "When the end comes, do not leave me. I will never leave you." Elias swore, "Not in this world, not in the next." They stayed there for hours, wrapped in each other's arms as the fire died down to embers. They didn't speak of the soldiers or the reservation. They spoke with their hands, with a silent language of touch, mapping the geography of each other's bodies. It was a defiant act, a reclaiming of joy in a landscape of death. For that one night, the war did not exist. There was only the fire, the cold, and the woman who had turned his guilt into something that looked like redemption. The end of the world began with the sun. The dawn was a gray smear on the horizon, cold and indifferent. Elias had just returned to his own bedroll, his body still humming with the memory of Naylin's warmth. He was pulling his boots on, preparing for the morning watch. The crack of the rifle was loud, singular, and final. It was followed instantly by the scream of a sentry, Chaitin. Then the canyon exploded. It wasn't a skirmish. It was a deluge of lead. A volley of carbine fire ripped through the brush walls of the wickiups, shredding the fragile shelters. The air instantly filled with the screams of women and children and the terrified whinnying of horses. Elias grabbed his Winchester and rolled into the dirt. Bullets kicked up geysers of frozen earth around him. "Get down!" he roared, though he knew no one could hear him over the din. He scrambled toward the center of the camp. The smoke was already thick, white powder smoke mixing with the black smoke of burning brush. The soldiers had set fire to the perimeter. He saw blue coats swarming over the rise, dismounted cavalry, moving in a skirmish line. They were efficient, brutal. Elias slid behind a deadfall log and leveled his rifle. He didn't think. He didn't hesitate. He saw a sergeant shouting orders, pointing toward the women's shelter. Elias squeezed the trigger. The sergeant dropped. Elias levered the action, ejected the shell, and fired again. A corporal spun around, clutching his shoulder. He wasn't fighting for the army anymore. He wasn't fighting for a flag. He was fighting for Nalin. Elias. He turned. Nalin was crouching behind a boulder, firing a revolver with both hands. Her face was streaked with soot, her eyes wide with a feral rage. "The wash!" Elias shouted, pointing to the narrow ravine at the back of the camp. "Get them to the wash. It's the only way out." Nalin nodded. She didn't wait for him. She ran into the open, grabbing a child who was wandering dazed in the smoke, and shoved him toward the ravine. Elias provided cover fire. He knew the tactics. He knew the rhythm of the reload. He waited for the soldiers to pause, then unleashed a rapid string of shots that kept their heads down. "Flank left!" Elias screamed in Apache, a phrase he had learned from Chaitin. "Watch the ridge." The warriors heard him. They adjusted, moving to block the soldiers who were trying to cut off the retreat. Elias fought side by side with the men who had once wanted to slit his throat. There was no distinction now. There was only the tribe, but there were too many of them. The soldiers poured over the lip of the canyon like blue ants. Elias saw a scout with the soldiers, an Apache scout. The traitor! He was pointing out the defensive positions. Elias swung his rifle, but a sudden explosion of dirt near his face blinded him. A bullet had struck the log inches from his cheek. He wiped the grit from his eyes. "Sansi!" The scream came from Elu. Elias looked toward the matriarch's wickiup. It was burning. Sansi was outside, leaning against a grinding stone. She wasn't moving. Elias broke cover. He ran through the hail of lead. Keeping low, he reached the old woman and slid into the dirt beside her. "Sansi," she looked at him. Her chest was a ruin of blood. Her breath was coming in wet, rattling gasps. She gripped her staff with a hand that was rapidly losing its strength. Nalin appeared on the other side, dropping to her knees. "Grandmother." Sansi looked at Nalin, then at Elias. Her eyes were glazing over, but the fire in them had not gone out. "Go," she rasped. "The wash. Go up. We can carry you," Nalin sobbed, reaching for her. "No," Sansi said. Her voice was a whisper, but it carried the weight of iron. "I am heavy. The mountain is steep." She reached out, her hand trembling. She grabbed Nalin's hand, then she reached for Elias. Her grip was surprisingly strong. She pulled their hands together, pressing Elias's rough, bloodied palm against Nalin's. The custom. Sansi wheezed. She coughed, blood flecking her lips. Elias leaned closer. "I failed you. Sansi, I didn't stop them." Sansi shook her head. "A true guest delights the women by staying." She squeezed their hands together, her nails digging into their skin. "By staying. When it hurts to stay." She looked at Elias, her eyes locking onto his. "Take her. Take them. Be the wolf." Her grip slackened. The light went out of her eyes, not fading but vanishing instantly, like a candle snuffed by the wind. Sansi was gone. Nalin let out a sound that wasn't a scream. It was a tear in the fabric of the world. She buried her face in Sansi's lap. "We have to go," Elias shouted, grabbing Nalin by the shoulder. "Nalin, we have to go. She gave us an order." He hauled her up. Nalin was limp, blinded by tears. Elias practically dragged her toward the ravine. Bullets whined past them like angry hornets. They reached the mouth of the wash. The surviving warriors were holding the rear, firing desperately to buy time for the women and children to climb the loose shale. Elias pushed Nalin ahead of him. "Climb! Don't look back!" He turned and fired 3 last shots at the advancing blue line, dropping a soldier who had gotten too close. Then he turned and scrambled up the rocks, leaving the burning camp, the dead bodies, and the life they had tried to build behind in the smoke. They climbed until their lungs burned and their legs turned to jelly. They climbed until the sounds of gunfire faded into the distance, replaced by the howling of the mountain wind. The new camp, if it could be called that, was a ledge on the side of a granite peak, exposed and freezing. There was no shelter. There was no fire. The survivors huddled together. There were 30 of them left, half the band. Elias sat on a cold stone, his head in his hands. The adrenaline had crashed, leaving him hollowed out. He looked at his hands. They were stained with gun oil and Sansi's blood. He felt a crushing weight settle on his shoulders. Had he led them here? Had the traitors tracked him? Was he the curse? He felt a presence. Nalin sat down beside him. She was shivering, her coat torn, her face streaked with soot and tears. But she was alive. "It was me," Elias whispered. He didn't look at her. "They followed me, the traitors. They knew. I killed her. Nalin, I killed Sansi. I killed them all." He waited for her anger. He waited for the knife. He waited for her to tell him to leave, to die, to vanish. Instead, he felt her arm go around his shoulders. She leaned her head against his. She was solid. She was warm. "No," she said firmly. Her voice was raspy from the smoke, but steady. "You did not bring them. Elias, they have been coming since before you were born. They come for the land. They come for the water. They do not need a reason to kill us." She took his hand, the hand that was stained with blood, and held it tight. "Sansi told you to stay," Nalin said. "She blessed us. Do not dishonor her by running away into your guilt." Elias turned to look at her. Her eyes were red-rimmed, full of a pain so deep it looked like madness. But beneath it, there was a steel rod of resolve. "You are the guest," she whispered. "You have to delight us now, by living, by fighting." Elias looked at the woman he loved. He saw the ashes of her life settling on her hair. He saw the terror of the future in her eyes, and he saw the fierce, unyielding love that refused to let him go. He squeezed her hand back. "I will stay," he said. The wind howled around them, screaming off the peaks, promising a night of bitter cold, but on that ledge, amidst the ruin of their world. Elias and Nalin sat together, holding on to the only thing the soldiers couldn't kill. The wind in the high country did not just blow. It scoured. It stripped the warmth from the air and the hope from the soul. They had climbed above the timberline, into a granite desolation where the only things that grew were lichen and ice. The camp, if a collection of shivering bodies huddled in a shallow depression of rock could be called a camp, was a place of silent desperation. They had been there for 6 days. Hunger was no longer a sensation. It was a constant, dull ache in the center of the body, a void that swallowed thought. The snares Elias set came up empty. The rabbits and ground squirrels had gone to ground, burying themselves deep beneath the frozen scree to sleep out the winter. The refugees existed on melted snow and a paste made from the inner bark of the few stunted pines they could find lower down the slope. Elias Ward moved through the camp like a specter. His coat was shredded, the lining hanging in strips. His boots were wrapped in layers of sacking to keep his toes from turning black. He spent his daylight hours checking the perimeter, looking for tracks in the dusting of snow that fell every afternoon, or gathering deadwood from the treacherous slopes below. He watched the children. They had stopped crying days ago. Now, they just sat, their eyes large and glassy, moving as little as possible to conserve energy. He watched Nalin. She was the steel spine of the group, dividing the meager rations, tending to the wounds of the warriors who had been hit in the retreat. But he saw the tremor in her hands when she thought no one was looking. He saw the way she stared at the northern horizon, where the storm clouds gathered like an approaching army. They were dying. It wasn't the sudden, violent death of a bullet, but the slow, erasing death of exposure and starvation. On the 7th evening, Elias found Nalin near the edge of the drop-off. She was scraping the last of the dried meat dust into a pot of boiling water. The steam was the only warmth for miles. "We cannot stay here," Elias said. His voice was rough, his throat raw from the cold air. Nalin didn't look up. "We cannot go down. The bluecoats are patrolling the foothills. We saw their fires last night." "We will starve. Nalin, we will survive," she countered, though her voice lacked its usual fire. "We are Apache. We have endured worse." "Not like this," Elias said. He sat down on a flat rock opposite her. He had been turning the thought over in his mind for 2 days, polishing it until it was as sharp and cold as a knife blade. It was the only way. It was the final payment of the debt he felt he owed. "I have a plan," he said. Nalin looked up then. Her eyes were shadowed. dark circles bruising the skin beneath them. "What plan?" "I go down," Elias said. "Alone." Nayland stopped stirring. She went very still. "I am a white man," Elias continued, speaking quickly before he could lose his nerve. "To them, I am just a drifter, a cowboy who got lost or ran into trouble. If I go down the South Ridge, I can make myself seen. I can lead them away." "Lead them away?" Nalin repeated, her voice dangerously quiet. "I can make them think I am the only one, or that the band went west, toward the Verde. I can draw their eyes. I can buy you time to cross the pass into the deep range." "And what happens to you?" she asked. Elias looked at his hands. They were cracked and bleeding, the knuckles swollen. "I will tell them I deserted the army years ago. They will arrest me, maybe prison, but they won't kill me on sight. Not like they would kill you." "You are lying," Nayland said. She stood up, the ladle clattering against the stone pot. "You are a deserter. Elias, you told me, if they catch you, they will hang you, or they will shoot you for a spy because you have been with us. You are not going down there to trick them. You are going down there to die." Elias stood too. He tried to keep his voice steady. "If I stay, I eat food the children need. If I stay, I am just another mouth. My life, it isn't worth as much as yours. It isn't worth as much as the tribe." Nayland stepped closer. The wind whipped her hair across her face, but she didn't brush it away. Her eyes were blazing with a sudden, terrified fury. "Is that what you think?" she hissed. "You think you are trash? You think because of what happened 5 years ago, you can just throw yourself away?" "It is the only way to save you," Elias shouted back, the wind snatching his words. "I do not want to be saved by your suicide," Nayland screamed. She shoved him. It wasn't a hard shove, but it rocked him on his heels. "You promised," she cried, her voice cracking. "In the canyon. You promised you would stay. You said you would be the wolf. Wolves do not leave the pack to die alone." Elias grabbed her shoulders. "I'm trying to keep you alive. I don't care," Nalin sobbed. The anger broke, shattering into a million pieces of grief. She grabbed the lapels of his tattered coat, her fingers digging into the wool. She pulled him down, burying her face in his chest. "I cannot do it. Elias," she wept, "I cannot bury another man I love. Do not ask me to do it. Coda is gone. My son is gone. Sansi is gone. If you go down there and let them kill you, I will lay down in the snow and I will not get up." Her words hit him like physical blows. The wall he had built around his heart, the wall of martyrdom and self-sacrifice, crumbled into dust. He had convinced himself that leaving was the noble thing, the strong thing. But looking at her, feeling her shake against him, he realized it was the easy thing. Dying was easy. Staying and watching them suffer. Staying and fighting when there was no hope. That was the hard thing. And he realized something else. He wasn't just afraid of dying. Elias wrapped his arms around her, crushing her to him. He buried his face in her hair, breathing in the scent of smoke and pine. "I'm scared. Nalin," he confessed, his voice breaking. "I am scared to death." "Scared of the soldiers?" she asked into his chest. "Scared of losing you," he whispered. "Scared that if I close my eyes, you will be gone. Scared that I found the only place I belong, and now the world is burning it down." Nayland pulled back. She looked up at him. Tears were freezing on her cheeks. "Then do not leave," she said fiercely. "We live together, or we die together, but we do it here. We do it side by side." She pulled his head down to hers. The kiss was desperate, tasting of salt and freezing air. It was a seal on a pact. There was no more guest and host. There was no more cowboy and Indian. There was just Elias and Nalin, two terrified people clinging to each other on the edge of the world. They stood there for a long time, the wind howling around them, their breaths mingling in white clouds. The heat of their bodies was a small defiance against the encroaching night. The sound of footsteps on stone broke them apart. It was Chaitan. The warrior looked like a walking skeleton, his eyes sunken, his skin gray. He didn't look at their embrace. In the face of the end, such things no longer mattered. "Scouts are back," Chayton rasped. Elias and Nayland pulled apart, but Elias kept hold of her hand. They followed Chayton to the small fire where the elders, what few were left, were gathered. The scout was a young man named Goyath. He was shivering violently, huddled under a blanket. "Tell them," Chayton said. Goyath looked up. His voice was weak. "The soldiers. They are not just hunting us. They are burning the ranches." Elias frowned. "Burning ranches? White ranches?" "Yes," Goyath said. "I saw smoke in the valley. The McCrae place. The double R. I crept close. It was bluecoats. They were driving off the stock and setting fire to the barns." "Why?" Nayland asked. "Why would they burn their own people?" Goyath shook his head. "I heard them shouting. They were blaming us. They were telling the settlers that Apaches did this, that we are raiding." Elias felt a cold chill that had nothing to do with the wind. The pieces of the puzzle clicked into place with a sickening snap. "It isn't a war," Elias said. His voice was low, stunned. "It's a robbery." Everyone looked at him. "I heard officers talking once," Elias said, his mind racing back to a saloon in Silver City. Months before he was captured. Major Higgins and Captain Reed, they were drunk. They were talking about water rights, about how the valley land would be worth gold if the railroad came through. But the ranchers held the titles, and the Apaches held the high canyons where the water started. He looked at Nayland. "They aren't just trying to kill you," he said. "They are trying to clear the board. They burn the ranchers out and blame the Apaches, so the army has an excuse to wipe you out. Then the officers buy the land for pennies when the settlers flee." A silence settled over the group. It was a heavy, suffocating silence. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. "So we die for money?" Nayland asked, her voice trembling with rage. "My husband, my son, Sansi, they died for money?" Elias gripped her hand. "No, not if we stop them." "How?" Chayton asked bitterly. "We have 10 rifles. They have a regiment. We don't fight them with rifles," Elias said. "We fight them with paper." He looked around the circle. The firelight caught the hollows of his face, making him look grim and determined. If this is a rogue operation, if Higgins and Reed are acting on their own greed, then the War Department doesn't know. The newspapers don't know. If we can prove they are burning white ranches, if we can prove they are falsifying reports, they will hang. Nayland finished. Elias nodded. "But we need proof. And we need to get it to Santa Fe, or at least to a marshal who isn't in their pocket." "Where is the proof?" Chayton asked. "In Rio Rojo," Elias said. "That's where the regiment is headquartered. That's where Higgins keeps his records. Rio Rojo is a fortress." Chayton said. Elias looked at Nayland. She was watching him, her eyes searching his face. She saw the plan forming. She saw the danger. And she saw the only sliver of hope they had left. "I go down," Elias said, "but not to die. I go to Rio Rojo. I let them catch me." "No," Nayland said instinctively. "Listen," Elias said, turning to her. "I am the bait. I walk in, I look like a broken man. I let them think I am just a drifter who barely survived the Apaches. They will question me. They might rough me up. But they will bring me to Higgins. And while they are looking at you," Nayland asked, "while they are looking at me, you and Chayton go to the livery. You go to the clerk's office. You find the man I know, Thomas. He's a young soldier, a good kid. He hates Reed. He might help us. It is madness." Chayton grunted. "It is justice," Elias said. Nayland looked at him for a long moment. She saw the fear in him, but she also saw the iron. He was offering to walk into the fire again, but this time, he was taking the fire with him. "We go together," she said. "I will not wait on the mountain. I will shadow you. If you fall, I pick up the torch." Elias nodded. "We leave tonight." The descent was a nightmare in slow motion. They left the others in the high camp with the last of the food. It was Elias, Nayland, Chayton, and Goyath. They moved like shadows across the snowfields. The wind tore at them, trying to throw them off the narrow ledges. The ice was treacherous. One slip meant a fall of 2,000 feet into the blackness. They didn't use ropes. They didn't have any. They used their hands and their will. Elias led the way, testing every foothold. Nayland was right behind him. He could hear her breathing, sharp and ragged in the thin air. They traveled only at night to avoid the patrols that swept the lower foothills. During the day, they huddled in crevices or under thick tangles of juniper, shivering and waiting for the sun to set. On the second night, they stopped to rest in a small arroyo out of the wind. They risked a tiny fire, no bigger than a man's hand, made of dry twigs shielded by rocks. Elias and Nayland sat close, their shoulders touching. The heat was negligible, but the psychological comfort was immense. Elias took Nayland's hand. Her fingers were ice cold. He brought them to his mouth, breathing warm air onto them. "Your hands are rough," she whispered, a ghost of a smile touching her lips. "Like old bark. Better to hold on to you with," he said. Nayland looked at him. Her face was gaunt, but her eyes were clear. "When this is over," she said softly, "when the fighting is done, where do we go?" Elias thought about it. He thought of the world he knew, the cattle towns, the bunkhouses, the endless trails. None of it fit anymore. "There is a valley," he said, "north of here, up in the Sangre de Cristo range. High up, the grass is sweet. There is water that never freezes. I saw it once when I was driving cattle to Denver. No one lives there. It is too hard to get to." Nayland listened, her eyes far away. "Is there wind?" she asked. "Sometimes," Elias admitted. "But we can build a cabin, with thick walls, and a fireplace that draws well." Nayland squeezed his hand. "A cabin," she repeated. It sounded like a prayer. "We will go there," Elias promised. "You and me, and anyone who wants to come. We will plant corn. We will watch the sun rise without looking for soldiers." Nayland leaned her head on his shoulder. "Keep talking. Elias, tell me about the cabin. Tell me about the corn. Keep the dark away." He talked until the fire burned out and the dawn began to turn the sky gray. He built a future with words, a fragile structure of hope to shelter them from the cold reality waiting below. Rio Rojo was a scar on the dusty plain. It was a collection of raw lumber buildings, false fronts, and mud streets that had hardened into ruts. The army had established a permanent garrison there, a sprawl of canvas tents and log barracks on the edge of town. Elias stood on the ridge overlooking the town. He looked terrible. He had rubbed dirt into his healing wounds to make them look fresh. He had torn his coat further. He walked with a limp that wasn't entirely feigned. He turned to Nayland, who was crouched in the brush behind him. Chaitin and Goyath were further back, invisible against the earth. "Wait for dark," Elias whispered. "Watch the jail. If I am not out in 2 days?" "I know," Nayland said. She reached out and touched his cheek. Her hand lingered. "Be the wolf," she whispered. Elias turned and began the long walk down the slope. He entered the town at noon. The sun was bright, glaring off the whitewashed walls of the mercantile. People stopped to stare at him. He was a specter of the wilderness, a man who looked like he had crawled out of a grave. He made it as far as the saloon before the patrol spotted him. "You there! Halt!" 3 soldiers approached, rifles leveled. They were young, their uniforms dusty but well-fed. Elias raised his hands slowly. "I ain't armed, boys, just looking for water." One of the soldiers, a corporal with a mean, pinched face, stepped forward. He peered at Elias. "You look like you've been running. Stranger, where you from?" "The mountains," Elias rasped. "Got jumped by Apaches. Lost my horse. Been walking for a week." "Apaches? Eh?" the corporal sneered. "You sure you wasn't running with them? We got reports of a white renegade." "I ain't no renegade," Elias said, letting a whine creep into his voice. "I'm just a cowboy. Name's Ward." The corporal's eyes narrowed. "Ward? Yeah, the major wants to talk to you. He didn't ask Elias to come. He swung his rifle butt. The blow caught Elias in the stomach. He doubled over, gasping. The second blow took him behind the ear. He went down hard, tasting dust and blood. "Get up!" the corporal shouted, kicking him in the ribs. Elias groaned and curled into a ball. He had to take it. He had to look weak. He had to look broken. From the ridge, half a mile away, Naylin watched through a stolen spyglass. Her knuckles were white as she gripped the brass tube. She saw Elias fall. She saw the soldier kick him. Every blow felt like it landed on her own body. She bit her lip until it bled, forcing herself to stay still. Wait, she told herself. Wait, do not ruin it. They dragged Elias to the jail, a stone block building at the end of the street. They threw him into a cell that smelled of urine and old straw. Hours passed. Elias lay on the cot, nursing his bruised ribs. He listened to the sounds of the town, the piano from the saloon, the rumble of wagons, the tramp of boots. The door opened. A man walked in. He was wearing a major's uniform, the brass buttons gleaming. Major Higgins. He was a thick-set man with a face that was red from drink and sun. "So," Higgins said, looking down at Elias, "you're the one who lived. I barely made it," Elias stammered. "They killed my horse," Higgins nodded, lighting a cigar. He didn't offer one to Elias. "Where are they?" "Ward. The hostels." Elias sat up, wincing. "High up, near the Dragoon Crest. They're starving. Major, dying. Good." Higgins said, "Save me the bullets." He leaned against the bars. "But here's the thing. Ward, we found tracks. Someone's been leading them. Someone who knows army tactics." Elias swallowed. I saw a Mexican with them." "Maybe him?" Higgins stared at him. His eyes were cold. "Dead things. Maybe. Or maybe it's you." He unlocked the cell door. He stepped inside, followed by the corporal. "Hold him," Higgins said. The corporal grabbed Elias's arms, pinning them back. Higgins stepped forward and drove his fist into Elias's gut. Elias gagged, his legs buckling. The corporal held him up. "You're going to tell me everything." "Ward," Higgins said calmly, adjusting his cuff. "You're going to sign a statement saying you saw Apaches burning the Double R Ranch. And then, maybe, I won't hang you." Elias gasped for air. I didn't see." Higgins hit him again, this time in the face. A bright light exploded behind Elias's eyes. "Think about it," Higgins said. "I'll be back in an hour." They left him on the floor, bleeding. Night fell. The town quieted. Elias dragged himself to the window. It was barred, but it looked out onto the alley. He whistled, a low, three-note tune, The Dying Cowboy. A shadow detached itself from the wall opposite. Naylin appeared at the window. Her face was pressed to the bars. "Elias," she whispered. Her voice was thick with suppressed tears. "I'm all right," he wheezed. "I'm all right. You are bleeding. It looks worse than it is. Listen, Higgins, he wants me to pin the ranch burnings on the tribe. He needs a witness. That proves it. It proves he's running a scam." "Where are the papers?" Naylin asked. "His office," Elias said. "Across the street. But you can't get in there. It's guarded." "We need Thomas," Naylin said. "The boy you told me about." Elias nodded. "The Bluebird Inn. He drinks there. He's tall, blonde hair. Looks like he hasn't started shaving yet. Tell him the man from the Verde Patrol sent you. Tell him I know about the girl in the fire." Naylin frowned. "The girl? He'll know," Elias said. "It's a guilt we share." Naylin reached through the bars. She touched his battered face. "I will come back," she promised. She vanished into the dark. Naylin moved through the town like smoke. She wore a stolen poncho and kept her head down. She found the Bluebird Inn. It was a rough place, but quiet. She saw him through the window. Thomas. He was sitting alone at a corner table, nursing a beer. He looked miserable. Naylin slipped through the back door. She waited in the shadows until he stood up to leave. As he passed the alley, she grabbed his arm and pulled him into the dark. Thomas gasped, reaching for his pistol. Naylin pressed a knife to his ribs. "Not hard, just a reminder." "Quiet," she hissed. "Elias sent me." Thomas froze. "Elias? They have him in the jail. They beat him bad. He needs your help." "Thomas," Naylin said. "He said to tell you he knows about the girl in the fire." Thomas went pale. The fight went out of him instantly. He slumped against the wall. "Oh, God," he whispered. "I tried to stop them too." "I know," Nolan said, lowering the knife. "But now you must stop this. Higgins is burning ranches." "You know it." Thomas nodded violently. "I saw the orders. They aren't official. He's writing them himself. And the land deeds, he has them in his safe. He's already sold the double R to a syndicate in Chicago." "Can you get them?" Nolan asked. Thomas looked terrified. "If he catches me, if he isn't stopped," Nolan said, stepping closer, her eyes fierce. "More people burn. More children die. Do you want more ghosts?" "Thomas?" Thomas looked at her. He saw the desperation and the strength. He took a deep breath. "I'm on guard duty at the HQ in 10 minutes, he said. "The major is at the saloon. Get the papers," Nolan said. "Bring them to the jail window." An hour later, Thomas appeared at Elias's window. He was shaking, but he held a bundle of papers wrapped in oilcloth. "Here," Thomas whispered. "It's all there, the fake patrol reports, the letters to the syndicate, the deeds." Elias took the bundle. His hands were shaking too. "Good man." "Thomas, what do I do now?" Thomas asked. "Go back to your post," Elias said. "Act normal. When the sun comes up, this town is going to change." Thomas ran off. Elias looked at Nolan, who was standing guard. "Hide these," Elias said, passing the bundle through the bars. "Do not let them find them." Nolan took the papers. She tucked them inside her tunic, against her heart. "I will keep them safe," she said. "Now go." Elias said, "Get back to Chayton." "I am not leaving you." Nolan said, "You have to," Elias urged. "If they find you, it's over. Go." Nolan hesitated. She looked at him, bruised and bloody in the moonlight. "I will come for you," she whispered. "I know," Elias said. She slipped away. Elias sat back on the cot, the pain in his ribs a dull throb. He closed his eyes. He had the bait. He had the hook. Now he just had to survive long enough to reel it in. The jail cell was a stone box that smelled of damp earth and despair. Elias Ward lay on the cot, his ribs aching with every breath. He had been beaten again, this time by Captain Reed, a man whose refined accent did nothing to soften the impact of his riding crop. They knew, or they suspected enough. "We've found your tracks." "Ward," Reed had said, wiping his hands on a handkerchief. "You didn't come alone. There were unshod ponies with you. You're not a victim. You're a vanguard." Elias had said nothing. He had curled inward, protecting the only thing he had left, the knowledge that the papers were safe with Nolan. Night had fallen hours ago, turning the single-barred window into a square of black velvet. The town was quiet, the uneasy silence of a place holding its breath. Then came the sound. It was faint at first, a scuffle in the alley, the dull thud of a body hitting the dirt, the soft click of a lock being picked. Elias sat up, wincing. The heavy iron door swung open. Nolan stood there. She looked like a shadow come to life. She wore men's trousers and a long duster coat, her hair tucked under a slouch hat. In her hand was a Colt revolver. Behind her, Chayton and Goyath loomed, their faces grim. "Can you walk?" Nolan whispered. Elias swung his legs off the cot. "I can run if I have to." He stood, swaying slightly. Nolan was at his side instantly, her shoulder under his arm. "We have horses in the alley," she said, "but we have to be quiet. The patrol is doubling back. They moved into the cool night air. The freedom tasted sweet, but it was fragile." As they reached the horses, a shout rang out from the main street. "Hey, who goes there?" A lantern swung in the darkness. 2 soldiers were rounding the corner. "Go!" Elias hissed, trying to mount the horse Nolan had brought him. The soldiers raised their rifles. "Stop, or we fire." Chayton didn't hesitate. He raised his own rifle and fired. The shot was deafening in the narrow alley. One soldier dropped the lantern, cursing as he dove for cover. The town erupted. Doors slammed open. Men shouted. The bell in the church tower began to clang, a frantic, jarring alarm. "Ride!" Nolan screamed, slapping the rump of Elias's horse. They tore down the alley, hooves striking sparks on the stones. They burst onto the main street just as a group of officers spilled out of the saloon. Major Higgins was among them, his face purple with rage. He drew his pistol. "Get them! Shoot them down!" Captain Reed was beside him, leveling a carbine. Elias saw the muzzle flash. He felt the wind of the bullet pass his cheek. Behind him, Goyath returned fire. His aim was true. Captain Reed jerked backward, the carbine flying from his hands, and collapsed into the dust. "Reed is down," someone shouted. "They killed Reed." The chaos was total. Settlers were running into the street with shotguns. Soldiers were firing blindly into the dark. "Don't run," Elias shouted, pulling his horse to a skidding halt. "Nalin, stop!" Nalin wheeled her horse around. "What are you doing? We have to go. If we run now, it's a war." Elias yelled over the din. "They'll hunt us to the ocean. We have the papers. We end this now." He turned his horse toward the gathering crowd. He held up his hands, showing he was unarmed. "Stop!" he roared. His voice, raw and gravelly, cut through the noise. "Stop firing." A few shots rang out, but the sight of a lone man riding back into the teeth of the guns made people hesitate. "Hold fire!" a sergeant bellowed. Elias rode into the circle of lantern light. He looked like a nightmare, blood drying on his face, his clothes in rags, his eyes burning. "You want to know why you're fighting?" Elias shouted, looking at the settlers. "You want to know why your barns are burning?" He pointed a shaking finger at Major Higgins, who was standing over Reed's body, reloading his pistol. "Ask him," Elias yelled. "Ask him about the Double R. Ask him about the syndicate in Chicago." "Lies!" Higgins screamed. "Shoot him! He's a renegade!" Nalin rode up beside Elias. She reached into her coat and pulled out the bundle of papers. She threw them onto the ground at the feet of the town marshal, a gray-haired man named Campbell who looked terrified. "Read them," Nalin shouted. Campbell hesitated, then picked up the bundle. He unwrapped the oilcloth. He looked at the top letter. Then he looked at Higgins. "Major," Campbell said slowly, "this here says you sold the water rights to the canyon 3 weeks ago, before the attack started." Higgins' face went white. "Give me that!" He lunged for the papers. Chayton leveled his rifle. "Stand down." "Major," the sergeant said, stepping between them. His hand was on his holster. "Let the marshal read." The crowd pressed in. The truth, written in ink and greed, began to circulate. The falsified reports, the orders to burn settler homes and blame the Apaches, the promise of kickbacks. The mood in the streets shifted. It turned from panic to a cold, hard anger. These men had lost cattle. They had lost friends. And they had been played for fools. Higgins looked around. He saw no allies. He saw only a ring of wolves. He dropped his hand from his gun. It was necessary. He spat, his voice trembling. "Progress. The railroad." "Shut up," Campbell said. He looked at the sergeant. "Take him into custody. We'll let the circuit judge sort this out." The sergeant nodded. 2 soldiers grabbed Higgins, stripping him of his weapons. Campbell looked up at Elias and Nalin. The crowd was muttering, but the guns were lowered. "You stopped a war tonight, son," Campbell said. "But you killed an officer. Reed is dead. Even if he was crooked, the army won't let that slide." Elias looked at Reed's body. He felt no triumph, only a heavy weariness. "So what happens now?" Elias asked. "General Crook is in Santa Fe," the sergeant said. "He'll send new orders. Higgins is done. But the orders to clear the territory stand. The Apaches go to San Carlos." "San Carlos," Nalin said bitterly. "The reservation. It is a prison of dust. It's better than a grave." "Ma'am," the sergeant said, not unkindly, "and it's the only offer on the table. If you refuse, the next regiment won't ask questions." Elias looked at Nalin. The adrenaline was fading, leaving them shivering in the cold night air. They had won a victory, but it felt like a defeat. They had exposed the lie, but they hadn't changed the world. The sun rose on a changed landscape. The tension in town had broken, replaced by a sullen quiet. Higgins was in the same cell Elias had occupied. Elias and Nalin stood on the edge of town, near the livery stable where their horses were being fed. The sergeant approached them. "I have a proposition," the sergeant said. "You testify against Higgins. You guide the rest of your people in. You do that, and the charges against you for desertion and the other complications go away. You walk free. Ward, Elias looked at the man. And the tribe? They go to San Carlos. Under guard. But safe. No more shooting. Elias looked at Nalin. She was staring at the horizon, her face unreadable. I need a moment, Elias said. The sergeant nodded and walked away. Elias turned to Nalin. He took her hands. They were cold. We can't win, Nalin said softly. Not the way we wanted. No, Elias said. If we go to San Carlos, she said, her voice trembling. We die slowly. The spirit dies. I have seen men there. They sit in the dirt and drink whiskey until they forget their names. But if we run, Elias said, they will hunt us. We will spend the rest of our lives looking over our shoulders. We will never be safe. We will never build that cabin. Nalin squeezed his hands. Is safety the only thing that matters? She asked. She looked deep into his eyes. You told me once you wanted a place where no one owns another's life. Can we find that at San Carlos? Can we find that if we are running like coyotes? Elias thought of the valley he had told her about, the high place in the Sangre de Cristo, the wind, the grass. There is a third way, he said. Nalin tilted her head. The sergeant needs a victory, Elias said. He needs to bring the band in, but he doesn't know how many of us there are. He lowered his voice. We split the tribe. Those who are old, those who are sick, those who are tired of running. They go to the reservation. Thomas, the boy who helped us, he can go with them. He will ensure they are treated well. And the rest? Nalin asked. The rest of us vanish, Elias said. We go north, not to fight, not to raid, just to live. We find that valley, and we stay there until the world forgets us. Nalin's eyes widened. It is dangerous. If they catch us, then we die free, Elias said. He pulled her close. He wrapped his arms around her, burying his face in her neck. I want to build that cabin. Nalin, he whispered. I want to plant that corn. I want to wake up next to you and not be afraid. Nalin held him tight. She breathed in his scent, dust, horse, and the underlying warmth of the man who had become her world. Let us go north, she said. They rode back to the mountain camp. The news was met with silence, then a low murmur of discussion. It was a hard choice, but it was a choice. For the first time in years, they were not being driven. They were deciding. About half the band chose the reservation. They were the ones who had seen too much winter, whose bones were too brittle for the high passes. They said their goodbyes with stoic dignity. Thomas, the young soldier, rode up to meet them, promising on his mother's Bible that he would watch over them. The other half, the young, the strong, the stubborn, chose the north. The night before the separation, the women gathered around a fire. It was a small fire, hidden in a deep ravine, but it burned bright. Elias sat with them. He was not on the perimeter tonight. He was in the circle. Elu, the woman whose grinding stone he had fixed, spoke first. The guest has worked, she said. She looked at Elias with a smile that was sad but genuine. He has carried the water. He has carried the wood. He saved the child. Another woman said, he went into the town. Chaitin added from the edge of the circle. He put his head in the lion's mouth. Sansi said the guest must delight the women. Nalin said, her voice clear and strong. She stood up. She walked to Elias and took his hand. She did not mean he should make us laugh, Nalin said. She meant he should make us feel human again. When the world treated us like animals, he treated us like queens. When the soldiers brought death, he brought life. She turned to face the group. The custom is fulfilled. A murmur of agreement went around the circle. Nalin reached into a pouch at her belt. She pulled out two small objects. They were tokens, discs of deer hide beaded with intricate patterns of blue and white glass. Sansi made these, Nalin said, her voice catching. Before the raid, she said they were for a wedding she would never see. She placed one in Elias's palm and the other in her own. She knew, Nalin whispered. Even when I fought it, she knew. Elias looked at the token. The beads caught the firelight. It was beautiful. It was a piece of art made in the midst of a war. He closed his hand over it. Thank you, he said. His voice was thick with emotion. He looked at the faces around the fire. "I have no family," he said. "I have been alone a long time. But tonight I am not alone. You are never alone." Elu said, "You are Pack." They moved at first light. The group bound for the reservation rode south, a slow, mournful procession. Elias and Nalin watched them go until they disappeared into the dust of the valley. Then they turned their horses north. The path to the Sangre de Cristo was a goat trail that wound through the teeth of the mountains. It was steep, treacherous, and cold, but the air was clear. Elias rode in the lead, his Winchester scabbarded, his eyes scanning the trail. Nalin rode beside him. The sun crested the peaks, painting the snow with streaks of pink and gold. It was a harsh land, a land that didn't care if you lived or died, but it was vast. It was big enough to hide a small valley. It was big enough to hold a new beginning. Nalin reached out. Elias took her hand, their fingers interlaced, warm skin against warm skin. It was a familiar touch now, a language they had invented in the dark and the cold. It spoke of shared burdens. It spoke of the nights in the cave and the days on the run. It spoke of a love that was not a fairy tale, but a fortress. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. They just rode, climbing higher into the thin, sweet air, leaving the world of maps and orders behind. They were two specks in the immense silence of the American West. They were hunted. They were hungry. They were tired. But as Elias looked at Nalin, and she looked back at him with a smile that held the promise of spring, he knew one thing for certain. They were delighted. Thank you for listening to Apache Custom Requires that the guest delight all the women of the tribe. I hope this story of resilience, sacrifice, and love in the harsh beauty of the Wild West resonated with you. I would love to know where you are listening from. Please leave a comment below. If you enjoyed this journey, consider subscribing to From Wild West for more stories of the frontier. And please, share your thoughts and feelings about Elias and Nalin's journey in English. Your words mean the world to me,